which doesn't mean a whole lot anyway. But I got the first weekend I was on the job, had a very dear friend, sort of my mentor in ministry and everything. He called me up and he talked, and asked me what I was doing, and I kind of gave him a little bit of information, kind of what we were doing, and that we were going out to one of the other churches in the district for that first Sunday. And he said, "Well, George, I just want to give you a word of advice, and that is that no one under the age of 15 is scared of a DS anymore. And nobody under 15 knows what a DS is." So that kind of was a humbling thing for me and everything. I give you a quick story that just came to mind, was that children's sermons, and I don't have any successful stories of children's sermons.
Great, thanks for
yeah, I'm just telling you, I'm commiserating, because I set myself up a few times too. I'll never forget this. Was several years ago. I was going to talk to the kids about how they study all the minerals and chemicals and everything that make up our body and what they're actually worth, if you went and sold them and such. But how, I wanted to go on about how God, you're so special to God because he was willing to give Jesus for you. So I started it out, and I asked the kids, I said, do you know how much you're worth? And this one little boy popped up and he said, "My mama says I ain't worth 2 cents." So it was kind of downhill after that. So, well, this morning I told the folks out at Elbert they're my guinea pig, and so today you're kind of my guinea pig as well. So we're trying something a little bit different, and hopefully this will work. This packs out a lot of sound for the little bitty thing it is. So if I can get everything else going, and I believe we can do it. Okay, that didn't work. Oh, I see. Did it?
Into
embraces me. Thank y'all for the privilege of letting me do that. And I enjoy singing, and it always makes my wife happy. And so I always like to do that. So. Well, today I was thinking about what to share with you. The one thing that strikes me is that everybody loves a good story. I mean, everybody loves to hear a good story. Well, maybe I better retract that a little bit. I did meet a highway patrolman that wasn't too long about one of my stories. But other than that, most everybody I know likes a good story. And, storytellers are the people that hold our attention, that really entertain us. I think back about people like Mark Twain. We still read his stories today because he was such a good storyteller. I think about people like John Gresham that's made $1 or $2 selling books because he's a good storyteller. Or you think about a guy named Garrison Keillor. Some of you might have heard of Garrison Keillor with Lake Wobegon and Prairie Home Companion. He has quite a following because he's a good storyteller. So we always like good stories, even when it comes to the Bible. When it comes to the Bible, we like our stories, don't we? I mean, even in the New Testament, there's probably, some of us couldn't really quote many verses besides John 3:16, but when we start talking about the stories, the parables that Jesus told, suddenly we know. All we have to do is mention the Good Samaritan, and suddenly we all know about the Good Samaritan. We know that story. We know about the parable of the seeds and all those things. Those stories grab our attention and hold our attention. And I think that's why it's just part of our makeup. It's part of who we are. Because something about that story, those stories resonate with us. And they remind us of things that are going on in our lives. That's especially true of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we have those stories that are told of the times of old, and the one that came to mind, especially for today, was that story about David and Goliath. Well, all we have to do is talk about David and Goliath. Everybody remembers that story about David and Goliath, about David going up and killing the giant Goliath, and how important that story was to the people of Israel. And I thought about that story is that there are even people that probably couldn't tell you even what the Bible was, but they know about David and Goliath. I mean, how many of us have watched a football game or a basketball game where the announcer starts talking about, this is a real David and Goliath story. Talking about the underdog small team against the big powerhouse. That's the story. That's the story. Is that what does that story tell us though today? I mean, it's a great story, but what does it have affecting us? What does it do to tell us? And as I started reading through that story again and again about what it was trying to teach us, the story is that Goliath was this humongous giant. He's always called the giant. Some of the scripture, the historically little changes and such, most of the Bibles, the new translations and such, all the translations usually talk about that he was like 9 feet tall, and which that'd be big, wouldn't it? I mean, that would just be big. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the other manuscripts say, well, he was really closer to about 7 feet. And but when you consider that probably the average male in that time and place was probably about 5.5 feet tall. 7 foot's a pretty good sized giant still. But yet the story goes on. He says not only was he tall, he was strong. He was very strong in that he wore this coat of mail, that chain link armor that they often wore underneath the armor, that it tells us that it weighed 125 pounds. My right leg probably weighs 125. But it was just, it's a lot of weight. And this was something a guy wore, and he fought. And he was able to win a lot of contests. And yet it also tells us that just the tip of his spear weighed 15 pounds. And so, we're not talking about some little weakling. He wasn't just tall and skinny as a rail. He probably had a lot of muscle. So he's a huge guy. And what did he do is that he came up, the Philistines came up and battled against the Israelites. And as they stood there, they camped on across from a valley and from each other, and it said one day Goliath went out and he said, listen folks, won't we just settle this easily? He said, you pick one man from your army and you come over here and fight me, and if you win, then my people will be your slaves, but if I win, your people will be our slaves. But he didn't just do that once. He kept doing it. He kept doing it day after day because nobody wanted to go up against Goliath. They were all afraid, it says in the scripture. And as they fought, as they stood there, then it said it got into where he just started taunting them, saying things like, your mama dresses you funny. And, y'all wear, y'all wear, y'all are just a bunch of little sissies and stuff. He just started making fun of them. And then finally, by the time David got there, he even went as far to start telling them, well, your God isn't much of a God, or else y'all come up against me. He said, I believe there is a God in all of Israel. And that's when David came on the scene. He came to deliver something from home because he was just a shepherd boy. And being the shepherd boy, he came and brought the stuff for his brothers. But he started watching all that was going on, and he heard Goliath out there, and he started asking questions like, do you hear what he's saying about God? Are y'all going to let him say that about God? And of course the brothers got upset about it, but I think it was because they were ashamed that they hadn't stepped up. But finally the words reached Saul the king, and he went to Saul and he said, I can do this. I'll kill that giant for you. And they said, you're just a little shepherd boy, and here's this giant. How in the world are you going to do that? And he said, well, here's the way it works. He said, when I was a shepherd boy and I was out there in the pasture protecting my sheep, he said, bears would come up against me and try to get one of my sheep. Or lions would come up against me, and I'd kill them. But then he goes on and says something very interesting in that passage. He said, that God that allowed me to have the strength to kill the bear and the lion will give me the strength to kill this giant as well. And therein is the key for our passage today. As he goes on there and down to verses 45 and 46, this is in 1 Samuel chapter 17. David says to Goliath in this, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning with verse 45. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day, the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day, I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. You know, the first thing that I want to say is that when David first got there to the battle site, all the people were saying, have you seen the giant? Have you seen the giant? But David saw something different. He saw someone who was defying God. He saw someone who was mocking God. He didn't see the problem. He wanted to deal with the solution. But the Israelites were all worried about the problem. And so the question we need to ask ourselves out of the story is, who are you seeing in this? What do you see? When you're faced with the problems and the difficulties of life, when you're faced with obstacles in your faith or in your life or in this world, as you're looking at all those things, what do you see? Do you see a giant that's just simply something to be overlooked or just to be ignored or to look at it and just say, hey, that's just the way things are? Well, I know a lot of folks in this world that when they deal with situations, they'll just say, well, that's just the way things are. That's just what we have to deal with. That's just what we have to live with this, and that's the way we have to go on and just make the best of it. But David didn't say that. He didn't look at Goliath and say, well, I guess maybe we'll just be their servants and just try to make the best of this, and maybe we'll get by. No, he said we need to fight in the name of the Lord. I think about people down through the history that have done that have looked at a situation and said, this isn't acceptable. We're not going to do it that way. I think of a man by the name of William Wilberforce. You ever watched the movie Amazing Grace? It's about his story, about him. He was an English member of Parliament back in the early 1700s that looked at the slavery issue in England and said, this is not acceptable. And yet he went up again, even though he had poor health and had insurmountable opposition. People said, this is our way, our economy is built on this. This is the way of life in our world. If we do without this, then our whole nation will crumble. And yet he was willing to stand again and again and again until the day that slavery was finished. I think about John Wesley. John Wesley was banished from the pulpits of his church at that time, the Anglican church. They told him, you can't preach in our churches. John Wesley, did he just say, well, I guess that's just the way things are. I guess I'll have to just live with this. That's the rules. We'll have to do it that way. But instead, he said no. And he went out and started preaching in the open air. I love to read his journals about this. He said, I decided to do something so vile. He thought it was terrible, but he was willing to do it, even though the rest of the world mocked him. And he started preaching, and he changed the course of history in the English nation and in the course of history of our nation as well. Who would have thought that we would be here in this church today? But he did. He stood firm for the gospel. And he started preaching that gospel to people that the church really didn't feel were worthy of being able to be in their churches. He preached to the coal miners and to the orphans and to the jails. He went to the prisons and he proclaimed the message of Christ to a hurting world because he saw a solution and not the obstacle. He saw what God wanted him to do and not what the world said he had to settle for. I think about people like Martin Luther King Jr., who said he had a dream. It was a dream that he said, I'm not going to accept the way things are because I have a dream of what they can be. I think about Karen and I have 3 sons. We raised 3 boys. 2 of them ended up on the mission field. And the oldest one day, he and his wife, well, not one day, but he and his wife went on a mission trip and outreach to South Africa. And there, God showed him the AIDS orphans. Those children have no family, no adult supervision, who are left to fend for themselves because they literally overwhelmed the South African government. Not because the African government didn't want to do something, it's just they were so overwhelmed that they didn't have the means or wherewithal to do anything. And it just, God broke my son and his wife's heart. And now they're serving full time in South Africa, building housing homes for these AIDS orphans that there would be like 12-year-old kids that they're the head of the household, caring for their brothers and sisters. Or they do that, they run a feeding program so these kids can at least get a couple of good meals a week, and now they're providing training so that they'll learn some life skills, so that when they get to be young adults, they'll have some way to make a living for themselves. They didn't just look at the AIDS problem and say, that's their problem. That's just the way things are. You'll never change anything there. They decided, they realized that with God's help, they would make a difference. So the question we need to ask ourselves, what is it God's calling us to do as a church? What's God calling you to do here in Throckmorton today in terms of the gospel, so that you might make a difference, that you look out and people have been telling you for years, for decades, and say, well, that's just the way things are. And you say it doesn't have to be. What is God going to break your heart about? What's God going to tug on your heartstrings for to say it's up to you? You need to go and do that. And then David, it tells us a couple of things. Another couple of things is that first it tells us that when David showed up there at the battle scene, where the armies were camped out, the Israelites were running away from Goliath. But later, when we read after the passage there in 1 Samuel 17, after what we read, it tells us that when David went out to face Goliath, and Goliath says, hey, they're sending me a little boy out here, this is, it's an insult. And so it says that Goliath started walking towards David, but then it says, but David ran toward Goliath. Now, I think that's something else. You think about that. He ran. You got somebody you're going to have to fight. Don't you circle around, kind of like pro wrestlers, for the show, and you kind of walk around each other and everything. Instead, no, he said he ran. And he had that slingshot, not that little slingshot like we think about today, but that one that's that string that you spring and then you let go of it and it sends the rock off sailing. And he did it on the run, he did it with such an accuracy that he sunk that stone into the forehead of Goliath with an accuracy that would make an NFL quarterback envious. He was able to do it. He ran towards Goliath. That's a risk. To take that kind of a risk, to move forward towards the problem, towards the obstacle, towards the giant, instead of sitting back and saying, oh, well, maybe we can figure something out. Sometimes we have to take a risk and move forward.